The morning Mamie Kendrick set her first pie on the windowsill of the old trading post in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, she told herself she was not afraid, though her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the whole thing onto the dusty boardwalk below. She had been a widow for 7 months. 7 months since a fever had taken Thomas Kendrick in 3 brutal days, leaving her with 40 acres of grassland, a farmhouse with a leaking roof, 2 cows, a mule named Biscuit, and a daughter of 6 years named Clara who still asked some mornings when Papa was coming back. Mamie answered the question the same way each time, gently, without flinching, because flinching was a luxury she could not afford. She would kneel down, look Clara square in the eyes, and say that Papa was watching over the tall grass and that the tall grass would always be there. The 40 acres were not just land to Mamie. They were the thing Thomas had believed in with his whole chest, the thing they had mortgaged themselves to the bone for, the thing they had ridden out from Missouri together as newlyweds to claim and hold. The Kendrick land sat just east of Caldwell, which in 1878 was already becoming one of the wildest and most consequential cattle towns in the state, sitting right at the mouth of the Kishom Trail. Longhorn cattle moved through that corridor by the thousands every season, and the men who drove them spent money when they arrived. Mamie had learned that much from watching. She had learned other things too. She had learned that the land bank in town, operated by a slick man named Harlan Greer, held the note on her 40 acres, and that note required a payment of $14 every month. In the winter, she had sold a cow and her mother's silver brooch. In the early spring, she had sold the second cow, which had left her with only Biscuit and the chickens. By mid-April, she had looked at her flour sack, her lard tin, her sugar jar, and her dwindling store of dried apples, and she had done the arithmetic with a kind of fierce, mathematical clarity that surprised even herself. She could bake. Thomas had always said her pies were the finest thing west of the Mississippi, and Thomas, for all his faults, had never been a man who exaggerated about food. She could bake, and Caldwell was full of hungry cowboys. The first morning she brought pies to town, she had 4 of them, apple with cinnamon and a little nutmeg. She had wrapped them in cloth, loaded them into a basket, hitched Biscuit to the small flat wagon, set Clara beside her on the bench, and driven the 3 miles into town on a road that was still a little soft from the spring rains. She had no permit, no stall, no arrangement with anyone. She simply found a spot on the main boardwalk near the trading post, where foot traffic was heaviest, set out her basket, and waited. She sold all 4 pies by 10 in the morning. She held the coins afterward, standing in the spring sunlight with Clara pressed against her hip, and she counted them with such concentrated hope that her lips moved slightly, as though she were saying a prayer. $2.40. Not enough for the land note on its own, but a beginning. An honest beginning. That was the day Micah Hudson first saw her. Micah Hudson was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, lean through the waist, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red limestone that jutted out of the Kansas prairie in long, irregular ridges. He had dark brown hair that curled slightly at the ends when the weather was humid, and eyes of a particular shade of gray-green that changed color depending on the light, so that in the morning sun they appeared almost gold, and in the shade of a building they went nearly slate. He had been a cattle hand for 8 years, riding up from Texas with various outfits, and the previous fall he had decided, with the quiet certainty of a man who had spent too many nights sleeping on hard ground, that he was finished with the trail. He had taken a job at the livery stable on the south end of Caldwell, owned by an old man named Pete Rourke, who was happy enough to have someone capable with horses and willing to keep reasonable hours. The work was steady, the pay was modest, and Micah had been saving with the single-minded focus of a man who had a plan, though he had not yet told the plan to anyone, because it was the kind of plan that felt fragile when spoken aloud. He wanted land. He wanted 40 or 50 acres of Kansas grassland. He wanted to raise horses, good ones, quarter horses with deep chests and quick feet, because he understood horses the way some men understood card games or scripture, intuitively and completely. He had been watching the land around Caldwell, watching the prices, watching which parcels came available, keeping his money in a tin box under the floorboard of the small room he rented above the livery. He had not been watching for a woman. He had not been watching for anything except the land, which is precisely the way that fate tends to arrange its more consequential surprises. He came around the corner of the trading post that April morning because he was heading to the general store to buy a new pair of work gloves, and he nearly walked directly into Mamie Kendrick's basket. He stopped in time, looked down, looked up, and found himself facing a woman in a plain brown dress, and a sunbonnet pushed back off her dark auburn hair, with a child leaning against her side and the most focused expression on her face that he had ever seen on another person. She was counting coins. She was counting them with both hands cupped around them, and she was moving her lips, and the expression on her face was not happiness exactly, though it contained something like happiness. It was more like determination that had found the smallest thread of relief and was holding on to it with everything it had. He stood there longer than was polite. She noticed him eventually because she noticed everything, and she straightened up and looked at him with the direct, no-nonsense gaze of a woman who had learned that directness saved time. "Can I help you?" she said. "Do you have another pie?" he asked, though he had not intended to say anything at all. She looked at her basket. "I sold the last one 20 minutes ago. I can have more tomorrow." "What kind?" he asked. "Apple," she said. "I have dried peaches as well. I can do a peach pie if you give me enough notice." "Apple is fine," he said. "What time tomorrow?" 8 o'clock, she said. "I set up here by the trading post." He nodded, touched the brim of his hat, and went to buy his gloves. But he thought about her the rest of the day in a way that was persistent and low-grade and impossible to explain to himself through any rational channel. The next morning he was at the trading post at 5 minutes past 8, which was early enough that the pie she handed him was still warm. He paid for it without haggling, which was not the cowboy way and which seemed to surprise her slightly. He carried it back to the livery and ate half of it for breakfast and the other half at midday, and thought it was genuinely the best thing he had eaten in years. He came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. By the second week, it had become a ritual so consistent that Pete Rourke commented on it with a low whistle and a slow shake of his head. "You're buying a pie every single morning," Pete said. "That's going to add up, son." "It's a good pie," Micah said, and said nothing further. It was a good pie. That was entirely true. But the pie was also something else, and Micah knew it, even though he had not yet figured out what he was going to do with the knowledge. Every morning he came to the trading post at 8, and every morning Mamie was there with her basket, and he paid her, and she counted the coins, and he watched her count them. There was something in that daily counting that he found himself unable to look away from. It was not pity exactly. He was clear with himself about that. It was something more like admiration. She was fighting for something with everything she had, and the counting of coins was the visible evidence of that fight. And it stirred something in him that was deep and old, and connected to the part of himself that believed the things worth having in this world required exactly that kind of relentless, determined effort. He learned things about her slowly, the way you learn about a landscape when you ride through it regularly rather than at a gallop. He learned her daughter's name was Clara, and that Clara was brave but shy, and that she had a habit of holding the hem of her mother's dress when she was uncertain. He learned that Mamie had come from Missouri, and that her husband had died the previous fall. He did not ask directly about the husband, because it was not his business, and because he could see that she was not the kind of woman who wanted sympathy from strangers. He learned that she baked the pies in her farmhouse, which was 3 miles east of town, and that she drove in every morning except Sunday. He learned she was 28 years old because she said so in passing when someone in the crowd asked her how long she had been baking, and she said she had been baking since she was 12, so 16 years. He did the arithmetic instantly and felt something he could not name. He also began to notice things about the situation that troubled him. He noticed, for example, that Harlan Greer, the man from the land bank, made a point of walking past Mamie's spot at the trading post at least twice a week, and that he never bought a pie, and that when he stopped to speak with her his smile was the kind that never reached the eyes. He noticed that the conversations between them left Mamie with a tightness around her jaw that did not go away quickly. He noticed that Clara always moved closer to her mother when Greer appeared. One morning in early May, he arrived at the trading post to find Mamie having what was clearly a difficult exchange with Greer. He kept his distance, but he heard enough. Greer was speaking about the land note. He was speaking about the payment being short by $2 last month, and about a late fee that had been added, and about how the bank had many interested parties for land of that acreage. He said the words interested parties with a particular kind of satisfaction that made Micah's jaw tighten. Mamie said very quietly, "I will have the full payment by the 1st of the month, Mr. Greer." Greer said with a small shrug, "Of course, Mrs. Kendrick, we all hope so." Then he walked away and Mamie turned back to her basket, and Micah watched her take a slow, controlled breath, the kind you take when you are keeping something difficult from showing on your face. She saw him watching, and for a moment he thought she might be annoyed, but instead she simply lifted her chin slightly and said, "Good morning. The apple is particularly good today. I found some wild honey at the edge of my property and I used it in the glaze." He bought the pie. He paid an extra quarter over the asking price and waved off her attempt to correct the amount. She looked at him with those frank dark eyes and said, "I don't need charity, Mr. Hudson." "I know you don't," he said. "The honey makes it worth more. That's a fair price." She studied him for a moment, then nodded and put the quarter with the other coins. He watched her count them all, the whole morning's earnings, moving them from one hand to the other with that particular focused intensity that he had come to look for every single day. And he thought, standing in the May sunlight on the Caldwell boardwalk with the smell of longhorn cattle already drifting up from the southern end of town, that he had better figure out what he was going to do about Mamie Kendrick before he drove himself completely out of his mind. He started looking for ways to be useful without being obvious about it. This was harder than it sounded because Mamie was observant in the way that women who have to manage everything alone tend to become observant, thoroughly and without gaps. He could not simply do things for her without her noticing, because she noticed everything. So he had to be subtle. When he heard from Pete Rourke that the road east of town got particularly muddy after rain, and that a wagon with a light load could get stuck, he spent a Saturday afternoon laying some flat stones across the worst section of the road, telling himself it was a general improvement for all traffic. When he noticed that the canvas cover over Mamie's basket had a fraying strap that was going to break soon, he stopped by the dry goods store and bought a new leather strap and left it with a note that said only, "For the basket, from a regular customer." He was not sure she would know it was from him, but he was certain she would use it because it was practical, and she was nothing if not practical. She knew it was from him. She knew because she paid attention, and because no one else bought a pie every single day, and therefore no one else qualified as a regular customer in any meaningful sense. She did not mention it directly when she saw him the next morning, but she did look at him with an expression that was slightly warmer than the professional courtesy she normally extended, and she said, "The strap fits perfectly." And that was how they both knew that certain things had been acknowledged without being spoken. June came in hot and brilliant, the way Kansas Junes did, with a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at, and a wind that moved through the tall grass in long, shimmering waves. The cattle trail was in full season now, and Caldwell was crowded and loud and smelled of dust and animals, and wood smoke, and the particular sharp tang of men who had been on the trail for months. Mamie expanded her operation. She had saved enough to buy more flour and sugar and dried fruit, and she was now bringing 8 pies a day instead of 4, and she had begun bringing small individual pastries as well, hand-sized turnovers filled with apple or sweet potato, which sold quickly to cowboys who could eat while walking. Micah noticed the expansion with a feeling that was partly pride and partly something more complicated. He was proud of her resourcefulness, the way he imagined you might be proud of someone you cared about, even if that caring had not yet been named or spoken. He also recognized, with a clarity that came from watching her count coins every single morning, that she was still not making enough. Not easily. She was making the land note payments, he believed, but there was not much margin, and Harlan Greer continued his twice-weekly walks past the trading post, and the expression on his face when he watched Mamie had begun to bother Micah in a way that went beyond general unease. He learned from the blacksmith, a talkative man named Elias Dowd, that Greer had been trying to acquire land on the east side of town for 2 years. He was buying up parcels wherever he could, either through legitimate purchase or through the bank's foreclosure process, and assembling them into a larger holding that he intended to lease back to cattle outfits as staging ground during the drive season. The Kendrick 40 acres was directly in the path of that plan. Mamie did not know this, or if she did, she had not shown it. Micah sat with the information for several days, turning it over, considering what it meant and what, if anything, he ought to do about it. On the third day of sitting with it, he did something he had not done since he was a young man on his first cattle drive and was frightened down to his bones. He asked himself what he was actually afraid of, and he answered the question honestly. He was afraid of caring too much about a situation he had no right to be invested in. He was afraid of Mamie Kendrick's opinion of him. He was afraid that if he said or did the wrong thing, she would look at him with those direct dark eyes and tell him politely that his concern was not wanted. He bought his pie the next morning and stood at the trading post longer than usual, watching her work, watching her handle customers with her quick, efficient manner and her occasional warm smile that she gave freely to children and old men, and which she held back from most everyone else. When the morning crowd had thinned, he said, without quite planning to, "Mrs. Kendrick, I wonder if I might speak with you plainly about something." She looked up from her basket. She was wearing her sunbonnet pushed back in that way she always wore it, and a strand of dark auburn hair had come loose and lay against her cheek. She looked at him with those careful, measuring eyes. "You may try," she said, which was her way of saying she would listen but made no promises. "Harlan Greer," he said, "do you know what he's doing with the land east of town?" Something shifted in her expression. It was subtle, barely visible, but he was watching closely enough to catch it. "I know he is a banker," she said. "He is assembling land," Micah said. "He is buying and collecting parcels, including some he's picked up through foreclosure. Yours is the piece he needs most. Your 40 acres sits in the middle of what he's trying to put together." She was quiet for a moment. Clara was sitting on a crate behind the basket, drawing in the dust with a stick, and Mamie glanced at her daughter and then looked back at Micah. "How do you know this?" "Elias Dowd," he said. "He talks when he's working, and I listen." She looked at him steadily. "What do you think I should do about it?" "I think you should know that he has a strong incentive to make it difficult for you to keep up with your payments," Micah said. "More incentive than a standard banker would have. He wants you to fail." She took that in with an expression that was not precisely fear, but was close to a kind of deep, animal alertness, the look of someone who has just seen the full scope of a threat. Then she said, "I have not failed yet." "No," he said, "you haven't." The conversation ended there because more customers arrived, but something had shifted between them. Not dramatically, not in any way that was visible to a passerby, but in the way that real shifts happen between people quietly at a level below the surface, like water finding a new channel through rock. He began to stay a few minutes longer each morning. Not obtrusively, not in a way that would suggest he was hovering or that he felt she needed guarding, because she would not have tolerated that. But he stayed, and he helped when there was a natural opportunity, holding the basket when she needed both hands, carrying a second basket when she brought one, occasionally speaking up when a customer was being unnecessarily difficult about price. He never undercut her authority or spoke for her when she was capable of speaking for herself, which was always. He learned this boundary quickly and respected it absolutely. She noticed. Of course she noticed. She was Mamie Kendrick. What she did not yet know was what to do with the noticing. Thomas had been her husband since she was 22. She had loved him in the way you love the person who is your entire adult world, completely and without a great deal of comparison available, and his death had left a wound that she was still in the middle of, still carrying, still working around each day the way you work around an injury that has not yet healed. She was not looking for another man. She had specifically, consciously decided that she was not looking for another man, because she had a daughter to raise and land to keep and $14 to make every single month, and a heart that was still in the process of mending itself. But Micah Hudson came every single day and bought a pie, and watched her count the coins with an expression that she caught when she looked up quickly, and the expression on his face during those moments was something she had to work very hard not to think about, because thinking about it led to other thoughts that were less manageable. One afternoon in late June, Clara brought the matter directly to the surface in the way that children do, without any warning or delicacy. "Mama," Clara said as they were driving home from town in the wagon, "does Mr. Hudson like you?" Mamie kept her eyes on the road. "Mr. Hudson is a customer," she said. "He buys a pie every day," Clara said. "Yes. Nobody else buys a pie every day. Some people like pie more than others," Mamie said. "Hattie Dowd's father buys pie sometimes," Clara said, "and he doesn't look at you like that." "Like what?" Mamie said, and then immediately wished she had not asked. Clara considered the question with the gravity of a 6-year-old who has been watching grown-ups carefully. "Like when you're trying to remember the words to a song that you know but can't quite get," she said finally. Mamie drove the rest of the way home in silence, and that night, after Clara was asleep, she sat at the kitchen table with her flour sack and her accounts book and her jar of coins, and she added up the numbers for the month, and then sat looking at the total for a long time without really seeing it. In July, 3 things happened that changed the shape of the story considerably. The first was that Harlan Greer raised her land note by $3, citing what he called an adjustment fee written into a subsection of the original contract that Thomas had signed. Mamie read the contract 3 times, then took it to the town's one lawyer, a thin, tired man named Stokes, who confirmed that yes, there was language in the original document that permitted such an adjustment under certain conditions, and that the conditions in question were defined so broadly that Greer could apply them essentially at will. She paid the fee. She paid it through gritted teeth, but she paid it, because losing the land was not an option she permitted herself to contemplate. The second thing that happened was that the biggest cattle outfit of the season arrived in Caldwell, 700 longhorns and 22 cowboys, and the whole town went thunderous, and Busy and Mamie's pies sold out before 9 in the morning for 4 consecutive days, and she came home each evening with her arms aching from baking and her coin jar heavier than it had been all season, and she counted those coins at her kitchen table with something approaching joy. Or the closest she had allowed herself to joy since Thomas died. The third thing was that on a Thursday evening in mid-July, Micah Hudson knocked on the door of the Kendrick farmhouse for the first time. She opened the door and looked at him standing on her porch with his hat in his hands and dust on his boots, and that particular expression on his face that Clara had described as a man trying to remember a song. She felt something tighten in her chest, not unpleasantly. "Mr. Hudson," she said. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said. "I heard from Pete Rourke that your roof has been leaking over the east corner. I'm handy enough with timber and shingles. I thought I might take a look if you're willing." She studied him. "The roof has been leaking since February," she said. "I know," he said, and then looked slightly as though he wished he had phrased that differently. "Pete mentioned it." In passing, she could see that he had come prepared. He had tools in the back of a borrowed wagon. He had lumber, he had shingles, he had clearly thought about this before arriving. She stood in the doorway for a moment, weighing it because she was a woman who weighed things. "I won't take charity," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering labor in exchange for meals if that suits you. I haven't eaten a home-cooked supper in 8 months." Clara appeared at Mamie's hip and looked up at Micah with frank, fearless curiosity. "Are you going to fix our roof?" she said. "I'd like to try," he said, looking down at Clara with a kind of easy gentleness that Mamie noticed and felt deeply. "You should let him, Mama," Clara said. "Water came in on my blanket last time it rained." Mamie stepped back from the doorway. "The east corner," she said. "I'll see about supper." He worked on the roof through the following Saturday morning, which was his day off from the livery. He was good at it, careful and thorough, and she brought him water twice and made a point of not watching him work too obviously from the kitchen window, though she was aware of every sound from above. Clara had no such restraint and sat below the ladder providing a running commentary of what she could see happening on the roof, which made Micah laugh. And the sound of that laugh came through the window and settled somewhere in Mamie's chest in a way that she acknowledged privately and set aside to think about later. They had supper together that evening, the three of them at the kitchen table, with a pot roast that Mamie had managed from the store of salted pork and root vegetables from her small garden and biscuits, and the last of the stored apple preserves. It was the most domestic evening Mamie had experienced in 7 months, and it moved through her in a way she had not prepared for, quietly painful and quietly warm at the same time, like pressing on a bruise you had almost forgotten was there. Micah ate with honest appreciation and without ceremony, and he talked to Clara with the natural ease of someone who was genuinely interested in what children thought, asking her questions about the farm and the chickens and what she wanted to be when she grew up. Clara said she wanted to be a horsewoman and a baker, and possibly also a lawyer, which made Micah look across the table at Mamie with an expression of such undisguised delight that she had to look down at her plate to manage the reaction in her face. When Clara was in bed, Mamie poured 2 cups of coffee and they sat on the porch in the cooling summer dark, and for a while they did not say anything. The tall grass moved in the wind and the stars over Kansas were enormous and thick, and the nighthawks were calling somewhere out in the dark. "You don't have to keep doing this," she said finally. "Coming every day, buying the pie, you don't owe me anything." "I know that," he said. "Then why do you do it?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark grassland. When he answered, his voice was level and careful, but she could hear something underneath it that was not level at all. "Because watching you count those coins every morning is the most honest thing I see all day," he said. "Everything else in that town is noise and pretending and men trying to be bigger than they are. But you're out there every morning fighting for something real, and you don't pretend it isn't hard, and you don't ask anyone for permission. I find that difficult to walk away from." The silence afterward was the kind that contains a great deal. "My husband has been gone 7 months," she said. "I'm not ready for—" She stopped. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm not asking you to be." She nodded. He stood up, put his hat back on, said good night to the night sounds of the farm rather than to her directly, which she recognized as a courtesy, and went back to his borrowed wagon and drove toward Caldwell. She sat on the porch for a long time after the sound of the wagon had faded. August was when Greer made his real move. He came to the trading post on a Monday morning, not on one of his usual casual walks, but with a deliberate, official quality to his stride that brought Mamie's guard up immediately. He had a piece of paper, which he presented to her with the careful satisfaction of a man who has been waiting to do something for a long time. The paper was a formal notice of default. He claimed she had missed a payment in June. Mamie knew she had not missed a payment in June. She had the proof in her accounts book, which was back at the farm, but she had the memory of making the payment and could recall the exact amount and the exact day. Greer was smiling in a way that made the paper feel like a weapon. "You have 30 days," Greer said pleasantly, "to bring the account fully current, including the accumulated late fees, which come to an additional $6.50. Mamie did not react visibly. She took the paper, she folded it, she put it in her basket. "I will look into this," she said. "Of course," Greer said and walked away. Micah had been close enough to hear. He came to her side as soon as Greer was gone. "Mamie," he said, and then seemed to catch himself on the use of her first name, which was the first time he had used it. She did not correct him. She looked at the basket where she had put the paper. "He's saying I missed a payment in June," she said. "I did not miss a payment in June. Do you have a record?" "In my accounts book at the farm. The receipts from the bank as well if Greer gave them." She thought back. "He gave a receipt in June." "I remember." "Find it," Micah said. "Take it to Stokes. Don't let 30 days pass without challenging this formally." She looked at him. His voice was steady and practical, and she was grateful for the practicality of it, because what she was feeling underneath her own outward steadiness was something close to panic. Not the kind of panic that made you fall apart, but the kind that moved fast and cold through your veins and made everything feel more fragile than it had seemed before. "I will," she said. And then she said, "Thank you," and meant it in a way that encompassed more than the practical advice. She found the receipt that evening and drove to town the following morning, not with her pies but with the accounts book and the receipt, and she sat in Stokes's small, paper-cluttered office for 2 hours while the lawyer read everything carefully and then looked at her over his spectacles with an expression that was more troubled than reassuring. "The receipt is genuine," Stokes said, "and the payment is clearly recorded. Greer's claim of default is without factual basis. That is the good news. And the bad?" Mamie said, "The bad is that making this formal challenge will cost you. I cannot do it for nothing, Mrs. Kendrick. And even if we prevail, which I believe we would, Greer has other options. The contract has enough ambiguous language that he can find new grounds. He will not stop simply because one challenge fails." She drove home with that in her mind and spent the evening on the porch thinking in the dark. Micah came the next morning to the trading post and bought his pie and waited until the crowd thinned, and then asked what Stokes had said. She told him. She told him all of it because she had found, without quite planning to, that she told Micah things she told no one else, not because he always had answers but because he listened in a way that felt true, without flinching and without softening things that should not be softened. "What does it cost to pay the note off entirely?" he asked. She looked at him. "Why?" He met her eyes. "Because I want to know the number." She told him the number. It was $112, which was the remaining principal on the note. Micah was quiet for a moment. She watched something move across his face that she could not fully interpret. "Micah," she said, and now she was using his first name too, and neither of them acknowledged it. "Whatever you're thinking, I won't accept money from you. You know I won't." "I know," he said. "I'm not thinking about giving you money." "Then what are you thinking?" He looked at her for a long moment with those gray-green eyes that were gold in the morning light. "I'm thinking about what I want," he said, "and whether this is the right time to say it." She felt something move through her that was not fear, and was not the grief she carried, and was not the practical, controlled determination that she wore every day like a coat. It was something older and less controllable than any of those things. "Say it," she said quietly. "I have been saving money for 2 years," he said. "I have enough to buy land. I've been looking at parcels out east of town." He stopped. "Specifically, I have been looking at the 40 acres east of town." She stared at him. "Not to take it from you," he said quickly, and his voice was rough in a way she had not heard before. "To buy into it, as a partner." Or as he stopped again and set his jaw in that way he had when he was working through something difficult. "I am trying to tell you something, and I am doing it badly." "Try again," she said. He turned his hat in his hands, a gesture she had seen him make before when he was choosing his words carefully. "I am not a man who says things he does not mean," he said. "So I will say this plain. I come here every morning because I want to see you. Not the pie, not the land. You and Clara both. And that's been true since the first morning you were out here counting coins in the April light and I came around that corner." He exhaled slowly. "I know it's too soon. I know you lost Thomas not even a year ago. I know you're not looking for anything, and I have no right to push. But I can't stand here another morning watching Greer circle closer and say nothing about what I'm willing to do about it. The boardwalk of the Caldwell trading post was not, by any stretch of imagination, the kind of place designed for the most significant conversations of a person's life. There were cowboys walking past and a dog barking somewhere down the street and the smell of cattle on the wind. But Mamie Kendrick stood in the middle of all of it and looked at Micah Hudson and felt, for the first time in 7 months, something that did not feel like grief or determination or calculated survival. It felt like the first line of a new thing, not a replacement for what she had lost but something entirely its own. "I need time," she said. "I am not saying no. I am saying I need time." "Time is the one thing I have plenty of," he said. He bought his pie. He left. She watched him go and then looked down at the coins in her hand and began to count them, and the counting felt different this morning than it had every morning before, still hopeful but hopeful in a different direction. She went home that evening and sat with Clara after supper and told her daughter, in simple and honest terms, that Mr. Hudson had said something important and that she was thinking about it. Clara looked at her mother with those serious 6-year-old eyes and said, "The song he was trying to remember. Did he find the words?" And Mamie had to put her hand over her mouth for a moment before she could answer. "Something like that," she said. September came and the challenge to Greer's false default notice wound its slow way through the legal process, and Stokes managed it competently enough. And in the end, Greer was forced to withdraw the notice on the grounds that the payment had clearly been made and receipted. He did so with the thin smile of a man who was changing tactics, not retreating. What Greer did next was try to buy 2 of Mamie's neighboring parcels at inflated prices and use the acquisitions to make the Kendrick land less essential to his plan, the idea apparently being that if he could root his staging ground around her 40 acres, the land would become less valuable to her, and she might sell voluntarily. He miscalculated. The Kendrick 40 acres, sitting as it did with a reliable small creek along its south boundary, was not replaceable by routing around it. Water was water, and there was not much of it in that part of Kansas that you could count on. Mamie knew about the creek. She had known about it since Thomas first brought her to see the land and said, standing at the edge of it, that the water was why the land was worth anything at all. On a cool morning in early October, with the light coming low and golden through the tall grass and the first real chill in the wind, Micah arrived at the trading post later than usual. He had something under his arm. He set it on the basket, and she saw it was a folded document. "What is this?" she said. "An offer," he said. "A formal one." "From me to you." She unfolded it carefully. It was handwritten in a clean, deliberate script, which she would later learn was the result of 3 drafts, the first 2 having been crumpled and thrown into the livery stall in frustration. It set out a proposition that Micah Hudson would purchase from his own savings 40% of the Kendrick land, paying off the remaining bank note in full in return for a partial ownership stake, with the understanding that he would run a small horse operation on the acreage in partnership with the Kendrick homestead, and that all decisions about the land would be made jointly between them. She read it twice. Then she said, "This is a business arrangement." "It starts that way," he said. "If you want it to stay only that, it will. I will not push for anything you don't want, but I won't pretend there isn't something else underneath it." She folded the document carefully and held it in both hands. She looked out at the main street of Caldwell, at the town that was wild and loud and full of men who had come to make something or take something, at the grassland beyond the last buildings where the Kishom Trail cattle had worn long, dark lines into the earth. She thought about Thomas, who had stood at the edge of the creek and believed in the land. She thought about Clara, who had told her to let Micah fix the roof. She thought about $14 a month in a coin jar and Harlan Greer's thin smile and the way morning light looked when it came off the tall grass. "When can you have the money ready?" she said. Micah's breath came out slowly. "Within the week." "Then I accept," she said. "The business arrangement," he nodded. "The business arrangement," he said. and there was something in how he said it that was careful and warm and patient, like a man who knows the right ending to the story and is in no particular hurry to rush the middle. 2 weeks later, Micah stood in front of the land bank with Mamie at his side and paid $112 to the teller, not to Greer himself, because Greer was conveniently absent from the premises that day, as if he could not quite bear to watch. The teller issued a receipt and a satisfaction of the mortgage, which was a document stating that the note on the Kendrick 40 acres had been paid in full. Mamie held the document the way she held her coin jar, with both hands, and she looked at it for a long time. On the street outside, in the October wind with the smell of wood smoke in the air, she turned to Micah and said, "Thomas would have liked you." She said it quietly, without any preamble, and he understood that it was not a small thing she was offering him, and he received it accordingly. "That means something to me," he said. "I know it does," she said. November brought the cold settling in across the Kansas prairie, and with it a change in the rhythm of things. Micah moved his horse operation onto the 40 acres, building a small corral along the west fence line and acquiring 3 young quarter horses, 2 mares and a gelding, from an outfit passing through on its way south. He was still working days at the livery, but spending his early mornings and evenings at the farm, and the arrangement was entirely proper by the standards of 1878, because he slept in the small barn outbuilding that he had repaired and insulated for the purpose, and there was no impropriety to speak of, though the Caldwell gossip network was aware of the situation and had opinions about it. Mamie still brought pies to town 3 mornings a week, now that the cattle season had quieted and the daily trade was less brisk. She no longer needed the income the way she had in the spring, with the land note paid off, but she continued because the baking mattered to her, and because she had built something real, a reputation and a customer base that she was not willing simply to abandon. She was also thinking ahead, which was a habit she had maintained since April, and thinking ahead meant keeping the money coming in even when the immediate crisis had passed. Micah bought a pie every time she brought them. 3 times a week instead of 7, and she teased him gently about the reduction once, which surprised them both, because it was the first time she had teased him about anything, and it meant something had relaxed in her that had not been relaxed before. He teased her back. He said the quality had gone down since the crisis passed, and she no longer had the motivation of desperation. She threw a dish towel at him. Clara laughed from the other side of the kitchen. Micah ducked the towel, grinning, and the grin was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him, and it landed somewhere in the center of her chest and stayed there. December was quiet and cold, and they developed the habit of evenings on the porch despite the temperature, because the winter sky over Kansas was extraordinary, full of stars and swept with cold, clear air that made everything feel sharp and present. They sat with coffee, and sometimes a blanket between them on the bench, not touching but close, and they talked in the easy way that 2 people talk when they have stopped performing and started simply being present with each other. They talked about Missouri and about Texas, and about what they had each wanted as young people, and what they had found instead. They talked about Thomas, a little, and Micah listened without trying to compete with a dead man, which she appreciated more than she had words for. They talked about the horses and about Clara's progress with reading, and about what kind of winter the old-timers in town predicted. They talked about small things and occasionally about large things, and sometimes they sat without talking at all, which was its own kind of conversation. On the 1st of January, 1879, on the porch of the Kendrick farmhouse with the New Year cold and brilliant around them, Micah said, "I have been thinking about something." She was watching the stars. "What have you been thinking about?" "About whether I should ask you something or whether I should wait longer." She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the tall grass. "How much longer were you thinking of waiting?" "I was trying to calculate an appropriate amount of time," he said. "I have consulted my own judgment on the matter extensively and reached no firm conclusion." She looked at him then, sighed long, and the starlight was enough to see his face and the expression on it was that song trying to remember look that Clara had identified months ago, which she now knew was what Micah Hudson looked like when he was trying to say something true and was afraid of saying it wrong. "Micah," she said, "ask." He set down his coffee cup. He turned toward her on the bench, and the movement brought him close enough that she could see every particular of his face in the winter starlight. "I am asking you to marry me," he said. "Not because of the land and not because of any practical arrangement. Because this porch and this farm and that kitchen and that child and you, every morning counting coins in the light, you are the thing I want my whole life to be organized around. That is what I am asking." She had known it was coming. She had known for weeks that it was coming, and she had spent those weeks examining her own heart with the same careful, methodical attention she gave her accounts book. What she found when she was honest was this: Thomas was gone and she carried him with her always, and she did not need to stop carrying him in order to move forward. The two things were not in conflict. She had learned that grief and living could occupy the same person simultaneously, and that one did not require the diminishment of the other. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Micah Hudson." He exhaled slowly. He reached out and took her hand, which was small and capable and slightly roughened from baking and farm work, and he held it in both of his. "You're certain," he said. "Not a question exactly, but a need to be sure." "I am certain," she said. "I have been certain for a while. I was waiting until you asked." He laughed at that, a low, warm sound that startled a night bird somewhere in the dark, and then without further ceremony he raised her hand and pressed his lips to it, and she felt it from her hand all the way through to somewhere very deep, and she thought that this was what the beginning of something felt like, unmistakable and irreversible and entirely, wholly good. They were married in March of 1879 in the Caldwell church, which was a small wooden building that had been argued over by 3 different denominations for the past year and was currently in an uneasy shared-use arrangement. The minister was a Methodist with a booming voice and a kind face, and he said the words with an enthusiasm that suggested he found the whole business genuinely moving. Clara stood beside Mamie in a new dress that Mamie had sewn herself from fabric she had carefully selected in the dry goods store, a blue cotton print that brought out the particular shade of Clara's eyes. Pete Rourke came. Elias Dowd came. Several women from the church came, including a particular friend of Mamie's named Edith Crane, who had brought her soup when Thomas died, and who now stood in the second pew and wept happy tears that she did not try to hide. Micah wore a clean white shirt and his best dark vest and the boots he had polished himself the night before. He stood at the altar and watched Mamie come down the aisle, and his expression was not the song trying to remember look. It was something resolved and whole, like a man who has arrived somewhere he did not know he was traveling toward and recognizes it completely upon arrival. When the minister said the words and Micah said his vows, he said them in a voice that was steady and quiet and absolutely certain. When Mamie said hers, she said them the same way. Clara, standing at her mother's side, took Micah's hand during the prayer portion and held it without asking permission, and Micah closed his fingers around hers without looking down, as naturally as breathing. They came home to the farmhouse on the 40 acres east of Caldwell. Edith Crane and several of the church women had been there before them to lay out a wedding supper, which was spread across the kitchen table and the sideboard in a tremendous domestic generosity that made Mamie stop in the doorway and press her hand over her heart for a moment. There was roasted chicken and corn pudding and preserves and bread and 4 different pies, including 2 of Mamie's own that she had baked the day before, because she was constitutionally incapable of leaving all the pie-making to someone else. That evening, after the guests had gone and Clara was asleep with a particular smile still on her face, Micah and Mamie stood on the porch of their farmhouse in the March cold. Not separate this time but together, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his, looking out at the tall grass moving in the early spring wind. "What does it feel like?" he asked softly, "having the land paid clear and the note gone?" She thought about it honestly. "It feels like breathing," she said. "It feels like breathing without something pressing on your chest." "Good," he said. "It's going to be hard work still," she said. "The horse operation is young. The pie business helps, but it's seasonal. There will be lean months." "There will," he agreed. "I just want you to know I understand that," she said. "I am not expecting easy." "I know," he said. "Neither am I, but I'm expecting to face whatever it is next to you, and that changes everything about it." She turned her face up toward him and he kissed her, there on the porch with the March wind and the tall grass and the stars above Kansas, and she felt the last piece of something long broken shift into place and hold. Spring of 1879 brought a renewed energy to the Kendrick Hudson farm. Micah acquired 2 more horses, bringing the total to 5, and built out the corral properly and added a small paddock along the creek. He had a gift for horses that went beyond handling, a gift for recognizing potential, for seeing in a young, unfinished animal the structure that would eventually become something exceptional. He began building a small reputation in town and among the cattle outfits that passed through for having quality quarter horses available for purchase or hire. Mamie expanded her baking operation with deliberate care. She had an idea that had been growing in the back of her mind since the previous summer, when she had watched the Trading Post's owner turn away customers looking for basic provisions because he was stocked out. She proposed to the Trading Post owner, a man named Caldwell, a weekly arrangement. She would supply his counter with fresh-baked goods 3 days a week, sold through his establishment, and they would split the proceeds. Caldwell agreed enthusiastically. The arrangement worked well for both parties and eventually grew to include a small standing shelf of Mamie's goods that Caldwell kept stocked as one of his regular inventory items. Harlan Greer did not give up immediately. He tried twice more in the spring to create difficulties for the Hudson farm, once through a dispute about water rights on the South Creek, which Micah had prepared for by consulting a land surveyor the previous fall and having the boundaries clearly documented, and once through an attempt to claim that the horse operation violated some county ordinance about commercial operations on agricultural land, which was simply not accurate and which Stokes disposed of without much difficulty. After the second failed attempt, Greer seemed to recognize that the 40 acres had become a problem too costly and too stubborn to pursue, and he shifted his attentions elsewhere. The word around town was that he eventually assembled his staging ground from other parcels farther south, which cost him considerably more than the Kendrick 40 acres would have, and the general consensus in Caldwell seemed to be that he deserved exactly that outcome. By the summer of 1879, Mamie's mornings at the Trading Post were not a desperate scramble for survival, but a genuine small enterprise that she managed with the same methodical competence she brought to everything. She still counted the coins when she came home, still moved them from one hand to the other with that careful focus, but the expression on her face when she did it had changed. It was not the hope under pressure of those early months. It was something more settled and more spacious, the satisfaction of a person building something real rather than fighting to keep from losing it. Micah sometimes watched her count, just as he had from the beginning, but now he was at the kitchen table with her instead of across a boardwalk, and sometimes when she finished, he would reach across and cover both her hands with his, and she would lean her head briefly against his shoulder, before going back to recording the numbers in her accounts book. Clara turned 7 that summer and then 8, and she was growing into a person of remarkable quality, fierce and curious and warm, with her mother's determination, and what Micah privately believed was a better temperament than either of them, more open, quicker to delight. She had accepted Micah into the family with the complete and unambiguous grace of a child who trusts her instincts, and she called him Papa by the end of their first year, not because she was told to, but because it was what felt true to her, and she was a child who operated primarily on what felt true. Micah loved her with the complete, slightly astonished love of a man who had not expected to have a daughter, and found that the experience was nothing like he had imagined and everything like what he had needed. He taught her about horses with the same patience and seriousness he would have brought to any student, never talking down, always explaining the why alongside the what. And she learned quickly and with great enthusiasm, which did not surprise him because she was Mamie's daughter. On a September morning in 1879, Mamie told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, over the morning coffee, with the directness she brought to all important information, and then waited for his response with an expression that was steady but was covering something more tender. He stood up from the table and came around to her side and pulled her up out of her chair and held her, simply held her for a long moment without saying anything, and she felt the particular quality of his silence, which was not emptiness but fullness, a man whose words had been overwhelmed by the size of what he was feeling. When he did speak, he said, "Are you feeling all right?" "Yes," she said into his shoulder. "Good," he said. "That's the most important thing." The winter of 1879 into 1880 passed warmly, in every sense that mattered. The farmhouse was crowded and comfortable, with Clara's presence and Mamie's baking, and the horses in the paddock and Micah's steady, capable presence filling the rooms. Mamie continued the baking through the fall but reduced her trips to town as she grew larger, and Calloway managed the trading post shelf without her being there in person, which worked adequately enough. Micah made improvements to the farmhouse throughout the winter. He rebuilt the front porch properly, widening it so there was room for 2 chairs and a small bench. He repaired the east bedroom where Clara slept, and he built a small addition off the north side of the house that would serve as a nursery and later, he supposed, as another bedroom as the family grew. He built things the way he rode horses, with attention to how each part supported the whole, and the results showed it. The baby was born in April of 1880 at the farmhouse, attended by the town's doctor and by Edith Crane, who had appointed herself unofficial support for this particular occasion, and could not have been prevented from being present by any reasonable force. Mamie worked through it with the same determination she brought to $14 a month land notes and false bank defaults, thoroughly and without excessive complaint. And at the end of a long and effortful day, a boy arrived, red-faced and strong-voiced and entirely certain of his own importance. Micah held his son for the first time that evening, standing by the window of the small addition he had built, looking out at the April tallgrass coming back to life in the spring light, and he was quiet for a long time, the way he was quiet when something was too large for immediate words. They named him Thomas James Hudson. Thomas for the man who had believed in the land and the woman on it, and James for Micah's father, who had died when Micah was 19, and who had been, by Micah's account, a quiet and decent man who worked hard and loved what was his with his whole heart. Mamie had proposed the name Thomas without prompting and watched Micah's face carefully when she did, and what she saw there was an expression of such uncomplicated gratitude that she had to close her eyes for a moment. Clara adored her brother with an intensity that was both tender and slightly terrifying, in the way of older siblings everywhere. She appointed herself his chief protector and educator from the first week, and she took both roles with the deep seriousness that she applied to all things she considered important. Micah said privately to Mamie that little Thomas was going to grow up very well educated and possibly somewhat overwhelmed, and Mamie said she thought that was a perfectly reasonable outcome. The spring and summer of 1880 were good ones for the farm. The horse operation was showing real returns now, with Micah having sold several animals to cattle outfits and one particularly fine young mare to a ranching family from the Oklahoma Territory, who had come specifically to Caldwell on the recommendation of a satisfied previous customer. Word about the Hudson horses was moving through the network of the cattle trade the way all useful information moved in the West, person to person over campfires and at water troughs, and the inquiry was steady and growing. Mamie's baking operation had become, by any reasonable measure, a small business. She had arranged with Callaway to extend her shelf space, and she was now supplying not just the trading post, but also the main hotel on Caldwell's Central Street, which wanted fresh pastry for its dining room 3 days a week. She had hired a girl of 16 from a neighboring farm, the daughter of a struggling family named Briggs, to help with the baking 3 mornings a week in exchange for modest wages that the Briggs family needed, and which Mamie was glad to provide. The arrangement worked well, and Mamie took her responsibility as an employer seriously, teaching carefully and insisting on consistent quality, and the Briggs girl, whose name was Ada, proved to be hard-working and quicker than average to learn. One evening in the fall of 1880, sitting on the rebuilt porch with little Thomas asleep in the cradle just inside the open door, and Clara inside doing her reading lesson, Mamie said, without preamble, "I have been thinking about what I am." Micah looked at her sideways. "What you are. What I have made," she said. "I started out trying to keep the land. I was counting coins every morning just to make $14. And now I am," she paused, looking for the right word. "I am something different than that woman, but I do not want to forget her. She was doing something real." "She is still doing something real," he said. "Yes," she said, "but with more margin, more room." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "It matters, the room, having some. I did not know how much it mattered until I had it." He put his arm around her. "You built the room," he said, "pie by pie and coin by coin." She laughed softly at that. "Pie by pie," she agreed. "I just bought them," he said. She turned her head to look up at him. "Why did you really? That first week when you barely knew me? Why every day?" He considered it the way he always considered important questions, slowly and without rushing toward an answer. "Because watching you was the first honest thing I'd seen in a long time," he said. "Everything about it was real. The work, the hope, the way you held those coins. I didn't want to miss a single morning of it." He paused, "and the pies were genuinely exceptional." She made a sound that was laughter and something warmer than laughter, and she settled against him on the porch as the fall dark came down over the tall grass, and the horses moved quietly in the paddock, and little Thomas made a small, contented sound in the cradle inside. And Mamie Kendrick, who was now Mamie Hudson, felt the full, solid weight of a life that was entirely hers, made out of flour and determination and grief and the willingness to begin again, and she felt grateful down to her bones. The years that followed were not without their difficulties, because no years in Kansas in the 1880s were entirely without difficulty. There were seasons of drought that made the grass thin and the water in the creek run low. There were seasons when the cattle trade slowed and the demand for horses softened. There was a winter illness that swept through Caldwell in 1882 and kept the whole family confined for 2 weeks. Micah and Thomas and Clara all sick at the same time, and Mamie caring for them with the focused efficiency of a woman who has determined that she will not allow any further losses, and who treats that determination as instruction enough. But the farm held. The horses kept coming, kept selling, kept building the reputation that Micah had believed was possible. The baking kept bringing in money, the hotel contract and the trading post shelf, and eventually a direct arrangement with one of the larger cattle outfits that purchased a standing order of provisions from Mamie every time they passed through Caldwell, which during the drive season was several times a year. The 40 acres, with their reliable creek and their tall grass and their modest but solid farmhouse, became what Thomas had believed they could be. A real place, a place people built a life in, not just survived on. Clara grew up fast and strong and extremely opinionated, in the way of children who have been taken seriously their whole lives. By the time she was 12, she was managing the morning baking schedule with the confidence of a junior executive, and had made clear to anyone who would listen that she intended to go to the normal school in Wichita when she was old enough, because she wanted to be a teacher. Mamie thought this was an entirely worthy ambition and said so plainly. Micah bought Clara her first real book on mathematics, a worn but intact textbook he found at the general store, and Clara worked through it in 2 months and asked for the next level. Thomas grew into a child who had his mother's dark eyes and his father's quiet steadiness, and his own particular gift, which appeared to be animals in general and horses in specific. He was fearless around them in a way that initially frightened Mamie, but which Micah recognized as a genuine, innate communication, not recklessness but a real fluency. By the time Thomas was 4, he was walking through the paddock with a confidence that the horses seemed to accept, and Micah followed him with careful attention and a feeling he could only describe as recognition. In the fall of 1884, when Thomas was 4 years old and Clara was 12 and the farm was running well and the debts were manageable and the future was clear enough to plan for, Mamie told Micah she was expecting again. She told him the same way she had told him about Thomas, directly and over morning coffee, and watched his face, and saw the same quality of quiet overwhelm that she associated with Micah Hudson when something was too large for immediate words. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his and held them, and she felt his thumb move gently over her knuckles, back and forth, the way he did sometimes when he was feeling something deeply. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Tired," she said honestly. "But good." "Good," he said. "Good is the important part." The second baby was born the following spring in 1885, a girl this time, healthy and loud, and immediately a presence in every room she occupied. They named her June, for the month of the Kansas summer that Mamie had always loved best, the month when the tall grass was fully green and the sky was fully blue, and the world seemed to be operating at its maximum possible capacity for beauty. June had Micah's gray-green eyes and Mamie's auburn hair and everyone's mutual stubbornness, which became apparent within the first year and never subsequently diminished. With 4 people in the farmhouse and 2 operations running steadily, the place had become genuinely busy, the kind of busy that is not exhausting but generative, the kind where there is always something happening and the something is almost always good. Micah added a proper second bedroom and expanded the kitchen, because the kitchen had always been the center of the household and deserved the room it had earned. Mamie planned the kitchen expansion herself, deciding exactly where she wanted the work surfaces and the storage and the window that looked east toward the creek, and Micah built it to her specifications without deviation, which was one of the many things about him that she loved deeply. One morning in the spring of 1886, Mamie brought a batch of pies to the Caldwell trading post, where Calloway had recently retired and been replaced by his son, a young man of 22 named Daniel who had grown up with the Kendrick shelf of baked goods as a feature of his father's store and treated it with corresponding respect. Mamie set out the pies and the pastries on the familiar shelf and stood for a moment looking at the main street of Caldwell, which was both the same and considerably changed from the street she had stood on 8 years earlier with shaking hands and 4 pies and $14 worth of hope. The cattle trade had shifted. The frontier was moving. Caldwell was somewhat quieter than it had been at the height of the Kishom Trail years, the wildness that had defined it in 1878 and 1879, gradually softening into something more settled, more permanent, more like the town it was becoming rather than the outpost it had been. There were more women's organizations now and more proper schools and more churches than anyone could reasonably attend. The world was changing. She thought about Thomas Kendrick, who had looked at 40 acres of Kansas tallgrass and seen a future in it, and had been right about the land even if fate had not given him the time to see it through. She thought about the morning she had come to this same street with her first 4 pies and her shaking hands, and the terrible pressing need to make something work from almost nothing. She thought about Micah coming around the corner of the trading post with his purpose-built expression, and his hands in his pockets and his eyes that went gold in the morning light. She walked back to the wagon where Micah was waiting, having accompanied her to town on this particular morning, as he sometimes did on Saturdays when the work at the farm allowed it. He was leaning against the wagon wheel with his arms folded, watching her approach with an expression that was entirely unhurried and entirely attentive. "All set," he said. "All set," she said. She came to stand beside him, and they both looked at the trading post for a moment. "Do you remember the first morning?" He did not need to ask which morning she meant. "You were counting coins," he said. "You were barely looking up, and when you did look up you looked at me like I was something in your way." "You were in my way," she said. "I was trying to count." "I know," he said. "I've always admired that about you, the ability to find something more interesting than me." She laughed, the genuine, full laugh that had come back to her gradually over the years of their life together and was now as natural as breathing. "You came back the next day," she said. "And every day after that," he said. "Every day," she agreed. She looked up at him. "You must have really liked the pie." "The pie was exceptional," he said, "but that wasn't it." "I know," she said. "I knew then too, I think. I just wasn't ready to know it out loud." He reached out and tucked the strand of dark auburn hair that had escaped her bonnet back behind her ear, a gesture he had been making for years, and she turned her face into his hand for just a moment the way she sometimes did, a small thing, private and complete. "Come on," she said. "Thomas has been with Ada all morning, and June is going to have had enough of being indoors by now." "June is always done with being indoors," he said, which was entirely accurate. They climbed up to the wagon bench together, Micah taking the reins, Mamie settling beside him with her empty basket across her lap, the spring sun coming warm and gold across the Kansas morning. The road east of town was dry and solid now, nothing like the mud of that first April, and Biscuit the mule had long since retired to a peaceful old age and been replaced by a proper horse, one of Micah's own, a steady gray gelding they had named Governor for reasons that made Clara laugh every time she thought about it. The tall grass was coming back up along the sides of the road, the particular impossible green of Kansas spring, and the sky was wide and blue in every direction, and the farm waited for them at the end of the road, with the horses in the paddock and the smell of wood smoke from the kitchen where Ada was probably already starting the day's second batch, and the sound of children somewhere in the yard. Everything had been paid for. Everything had been earned. The land was clear, and the house was full, and the life they had built together from a basket of pies and a daily purchase, and a woman counting coins in the April light, was a real and solid thing, not easily taken and not easily broken, rooted as deep in the Kansas ground as the tall grass itself. Mamie reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the morning's earnings and counted them there on the wagon bench, moving them from hand to hand with that old focused attention, her lips moving slightly. The habit had never left her, and she did not want it to. She had decided years ago that she would never stop counting carefully, because careful counting was how you knew where you stood, and knowing where you stood was the only honest beginning. Micah glanced sideways at the counting and felt the same thing he had felt on that first morning watching her from the boardwalk, the same deep, unresolvable admiration for a woman who looked at hard things directly and did the mathematics without flinching. It had not diminished. 8 years and 2 children and $112 and a rebuilt porch and a horse operation and 1,000 mornings of coffee and a life built together from honest effort, and it had not diminished at all. If anything, it had grown deeper, the way things grow deeper when they have room. He looked back at the road. The governor stepped along steadily. The tall grass moved. "How much?" he asked. "Enough," she said, which was what she said when the number was good. She closed her hand around the coins and settled back against the seat beside him. "More than enough." He smiled, looking at the road ahead, and she felt that smile without looking at it because she knew every version of it, and this was the one that was quiet and full and required nothing further. This was the one that meant home. The farm came into view around the last bend in the road, sitting solid and white-painted against the green of the spring grass, the corral horses moving slowly in the morning light, the kitchen smoke rising straight up into the windless blue air, Clara's figure visible at the fence line talking to one of the mares with her usual serious authority, and from somewhere inside the house, the particular loud and opinionated voice of June Hudson, announcing something to the general world that she considered important. Micah pulled the governor to a stop in the yard and set the brake and climbed down and reached up for Mamie, and she put her hands on his shoulders and stepped down. And for a moment they stood in the yard of the Kendrick Hudson farm on a spring morning in 1886 with everything around them that they had made, and everything ahead of them that they had not yet made, and it was enough. It was everything. Thomas came running from the side of the house with his dark eyes and his steady face, calling that June had knocked the flour jar off the table, and that Ada was not best pleased about it. And Mamie took a breath and squared her shoulders and went to sort it out, and Micah watched her go with the same expression that a man wears when he is looking at the center of his life and knows it, and is not afraid to know it, and intends to keep knowing it every morning for the rest of his days. He followed her inside. The door closed behind them both. The tall grass moved on in the wind, green and wide and patient, as it always had, holding its ground against everything, the way the best things do.